Today we're going to pick up by talking a little bit about human genetics, and a lot of what we know about human genetics comes from studying pedigrees. So a pedigree is like a family tree that tracks a particular trait over several generations. And sometimes genetic counselors will make a pedigree if they're trying to figure out maybe why a couple is infertile, or how a particular trait is being passed on, or the possibility that you might be carrying a particular trait. Now in today's day and age, we can do a lot of genetic testing where we can actually look to see what traits you have. But before that was available, this was really the best way to figure out how traits were passed on. So in this particular scenario, we are looking at widow's peak versus a straight hairline. So widow's peak is like a little point in the front. You can actually see this in the picture. We have this girl who has a widow's peak, and this girl has the straight hairline. In this case, they are telling you that a widow's peak is dominant and a straight hairline is recessive. And the people who are colored in are people that actually show the straight hairline. So immediately, we actually know from this pedigree, before we do anything else, we actually already know that everybody who's colored in has to be little h, because according to the information they provided, those people with a straight hairline have the allele for straight, which is recessive. And remember, the only way you can show a recessive trait is you have to have 2 copies of it. So we can actually look and see for these people, we can figure out in some cases what their genotypes are. So for example, Julia, we know is little h. On the other hand, Libby, we don't really know. Now, why don't we know? Well, we know she's not little h. Kristen is little h, because she has a straight hairline and it's recessive. Libby has a widow's peak, which is dominant, which means she could either be big H, or she could be big H. And you might say, well, is that the case for everybody? Is everybody, like Henry, could Henry be big H? And your answer actually for the case of Henry is no. And the reason why Henry cannot be big H, and this is where solving these is kind of like solving a logic problem. A couple of reasons that we can know that Henry can't be big H. The biggest one is that his daughter, this is a marriage, and then these are the children, his daughter Kristen is little h. Well, if she's little h, remember she had to get one of those from her mom and one of those from her dad, which means both Henry and his wife Isabel both have to be carrying a copy of the little h. So Henry can't be big H. And we know he can't be little h, because if he was little h, he'd have a straight hairline, and this says, and he'd be colored in, and he's not. So Henry has to be big H, and Isabel, his wife, would also have to be big H, and we figure this out because of their child. So the way a pedigree works, like I said, is they're going to tell you probably whether the trait is dominant or recessive. The people who have the trait are going to be colored in, and then they're going to ask you questions about what the genotypes of different people in the pedigree are. And again, you can't always tell for sure. So if you look here, this is sort of a walkthrough of what I just explained. So, for example, Henry and Isabel, since the child of one of their children has a straight hairline, we know that Henry and Isabel have to be big H, But notice how Libby could be either one. Now, how could we figure out what Libby is? Well, really, in a pedigree, the only way we would really be able to figure it out is when Libby got married and had her own children. We might be able to use evidence from her children, just like we used the evidence here of Kristen to get the genotypes of Isabel and Henry. And also, if we go up here to Beth and Al, same concept. Since their kids, Frank and Gary, are both colored in, they had to be big H. But Evelyn, we don't know. She doesn't have any children yet, and her parents were heterozygous, so they could have given big H, or they could have given big H, one of them, and little h from the other one. So there's a checkpoint question on the next slide, which basically says, if Libby had a child what phenotype in her child, meaning what physical trait, would let her figure out her own genotype for certain? And the answer is, if her child had a straight hairline and was colored in, then we would know for sure that Libby would have to be heterozygous, big H, little h. So, let me show you. I added this. This is actually not in your version of these notes, but I did add this to the master slides because I wanted you to have an opportunity to practice this. So a couple things real quick. Males are always going to be squares and females are circles. Usually they'll put a little key to remind you of that, but that's actually across the board in any pedigree. That's traditional. People who are colored in show the trait. That doesn't mean the trait is dominant or recessive. In some cases, that may be the problem that they're going to ask you, is to determine if a trait is dominant or recessive. They also number the generations. So generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. Remember, these are children. If the line comes out at the top, these are children from a marriage. If the line is across, this is two people getting married and then having children. And in this case, they numbered the people. In this one, they didn't, but we could add A, B, C, D. So this would be generation 1, A, B, C, D. This would be generation 2, A, B, C, D, E, F. And generation 3, A, B, C. So we could do that. So here's the kind of questions you might be asked. So in the first pedigree at the top, it says that the trait is dominant. So what does that mean? Well, that means that anybody who's colored in, since this is representing a trait that happens to be dominant, would either be big B, or big B, little b. Again, how do I know that? Because they said that the trait in this pedigree is dominant. So whoever shows it has this dominant gene or dominant allele. And that would mean that anybody who's not colored in must be little b. And I'm just using the letter B. I'm just randomly picking that letter. So here's the kind of questions you could be asked. You could be asked, hey, what is the genotype of person 1-1 and 1-2? What are the genotypes of 1-1 and 1-2? So you would go to Roman numeral 1, row 1, and look at person 1. Well, they're not colored in, so they must be recessive. So person 1 would have to be little b. Now, person 2 is colored in, so let's go ahead and write both possibilities, but then we may be able to eliminate one. So we know since they're colored in, they have to be one of these, right? Let's see if we can eliminate one of these two options. So let's look at their children. So one of their children is has the trait. Oh, this child does not have the trait, so this child has to be little b, because they are not colored in. Well, what does that tell us? Well, if they're little b, they had to get one of their little b's from this parent, and their other little b would have had to have come from person 2 in row 1. So that means this is not an option. 1-2 would have to be big B, little b. Now, let's look at row 2. Let's say person 2-1. What are they? Well, they do not show the trait. The trait is dominant, so they would have to be little b. They'd have to be recessive. How about Roman numeral 3, so generation 3, person number 5? Well, they're colored in, so they show the trait. So they could be big B or big B, little b. But let's see if we can eliminate one of those options. And we can't always, by the way. Well, let's look at their parents. This one has the trait, so they could be big B or big B, little b. This one, who doesn't have the trait, has to be little b. Well, what does that tell us? Well, whether this one is big B or big B, little b, which it actually has to be big B, little b because of the other child, but let's say we didn't know. We know that we got a big B from that parent, but since this parent is little b, they would have to have gotten their little b from that parent, so they would have to be heterozygous, big B, little b. So this is how you do these pedigrees. It's, like I said, it's very much like a logic problem. Now let's look at the second one. In this case, the trait is actually recessive. So that basically means that the people who are colored in this case, are little b. Why? Because they're telling you the trait, the thing that this pedigree is tracing, it's a different trait than our first pedigree. So maybe this one is tracking red hair, or this one is tracking blue eyes, or cystic fibrosis, or whatever. It's tracking some kind of trait. And the trait, they're telling you, is a recessive trait. So anybody who's colored in, because we know what recessive means, would have to be little b. So we know person B, for example, is little b. And anybody who's not colored in could either be big B, or big B. But remember, this is sort of like a logic problem. We can, in some cases, figure out which one of these it is based on their children or their parents. So let's start with row 1, person A. Well, they're not colored in, which means they're either big B, or big B. Now, can we figure out which one it is? Well, let's try looking at their children, because we know that if any of their children show the trait, we know all their children would have gotten a little b from their dad, right? All the children would have to have gotten a little b because that's all they're carrying. Which means, what did they get from their mom? Well, they must have all gotten big B from their mom. However, as we discussed in class, does that mean for sure this person is big B? Well, we really don't know. I mean, they only had 3 children. It's a 50-50 chance of you having a boy versus a girl, but you may come from a family of 5 boys. So it's possible, even if they were big B, they still gave the big B to all their kids. So to be quite honest, we're not going to say 100%. Kind of leans towards big B, but we don't know for sure. On the other hand, what about row 2 and the 3 children? A, B, and C. Guess what? We know for sure what they are. They are all big B. How do we know that? Because of their dad. Here, he is little b. That means they all had to have gotten little b. Since they're not colored in, their other parent must have given them big B, so they would all have to be heterozygous. So, hopefully that gives you sort of an overview of pedigrees and how you would work through them and how you could definitely eliminate some possibilities based on whether the person's colored in or not, but you may or may not be able to figure out exactly what their genotype is, what their gene combination is. Okay, moving on. So there's a lot of traits in people that are controlled by just a single gene. And I'm going to show you a table on the next slide. You don't have to memorize this table. I will tell you, you should know this word though. When people are heterozygous for a recessive trait, we call them carriers. It means they carry one copy of the gene for the disorder, but they don't actually show the disorder. So that's what that refers to, a carrier. And these are just a list: PKU, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease. These are all recessive disorders. And then these at the bottom are some examples of dominant disorders. You're not going to be tested on memorizing whether these traits are dominant or recessive. It was just to give you some examples. But here's a practice problem. So Peter is a 30-year-old man. His father died of Huntington's disease. So that means his father, now that happens to be a fairly rare disease. They said it was dominant, so let's just assume that the father is big H, little h. Could he have been big H, big H? Probably not. For one thing, his sister, the boy's sister, doesn't have the disease. So that would be a big clue. His mom does not have the disease, so she has to be little h, little h. His sister, like I said, does not have the disease, so she is little h, little h. And that tells us for sure that his dad would have to be big H, little h. So the question is, what are the chances that Peter has inherited the gene and will have Huntington's disease? So this is really just a simple Punnett square. His dad is big H, little h. His mom is little h, little h. Remember, you don't have to make 4 boxes, but you can. And unfortunately, the chances are 1/2 or 50% that he could have inherited this disease. This is a particular disease that you don't actually show symptoms until midlife, like your 40s. So even though he doesn't show symptoms yet, he could still have the disease. This is just a reminder that just because a trait is dominant, that doesn't mean it's more common in nature. It just means that having one copy of the gene, you will show the trait. So a dominant trait may be more common or it may be less common. And this is just showing that there's a variety of genetic tests that we can do to determine if you're carrying some traits.